Okay, so let's move on to exercise 4.20 and 4.24. We'll work both of these exercises in this video. Um, and the idea is that we focus here on the concept of logical consequence and the narrower concept of tautological consequence. So we have exercise set 4.20 and 4.24. Notice the setup. We've got a premise and then a conclusion. And the question is, does this conclusion follow truth functionally from the premise? Similarly, in exercise 4.24, we have three premises and a conclusion. And the question here again is, does this conclusion follow truth functionally from the premises? So what I'd like to do is to obviously complete the exercise, each exercise rather, as instructed, but also talk a bit about the difference between the larger concept of anacon and the narrower concept of tautcon in relation to each other. But first, let's go ahead and build our truth table for each of the exercises. Okay, so in Boole, I have constructed the elements for the sentences either A is a small tet or B is small, and either A or B is small. So what we want to do is build our reference columns. We have 3 atomic sentences, so that means 8 rows. True, 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 false, 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 false. True, true, false, false, true, true, false, false. True, false, true, false, true, false, true, false. Now we've got our reference columns with the standard layout. We need to identify the main connective for sentence 1. We don't have to do that for sentence 2 because there's simply one connective. While we're over here, let's go ahead and build the truth table for this sentence. So we have true, 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 false, true, 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 false. And then we have, for the first part of sentence 1, the conjunction A is a small tet, true, true, false, 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 false. And then the disjunction, true, 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 false, true, false, true, false. Okay, now let's make sure that we have constructed and completed our table correctly. We get 2 check marks, yay. Now, here's the question. Is sentence 2 a tautological consequence of sentence 1? In other words, is the argument valid? In other words, is it the case that there is any row on which sentence 1 is true while sentence 2 is false? And the answer is no. The 2 rows where sentence 2 is false are rows where sentence 1 is also false. So even though these 2 sentences are not tautologically equivalent, right, there's at least one row where the 2 values are contradictory. It's not the case that there is a row where the premise is true while the conclusion is false. In other words, the argument is valid. So let's mark our assessment. Just for fun, let's say we know that the 2 sentences are not tautologically equivalent, sorry. And we're going to say that the last sentence is a tautological consequence of the other. We're not going to go the other direction, right? Because the exercise involves asking whether or not the sentence A or B is small follows truth functionally from the premise. So that's all we're being asked to do, to verify the assessment, and yay, we're correct. Right? So remember, the possible worlds, possible scenarios have been exhausted. The conditions under which sentence 2 are true or false, the conditions under which sentence 1 are true or false, are such that there is no possible scenario where the first sentence or the premise is true while the second sentence or conclusion is false. Hence, sentence 2 or the conclusion is a tautological consequence of the premise or sentence 1. Let's move on to exercise 4.24. Okay, so now we're going to work on exercise 4.24. I want us to build this together and work through each element together rather than just show you a partially constructed table. That's because we've got a lot of elements. Let's count the atomic sentences together. We have A, B, C, D, and E. So we've got 5 atomic sentences. That means we've got a good number of rows of the truth table to construct. So what we're going to do is take our formula and apply it, right? The number of rows is determined by the multiplication of 2 to the number of atomic sentences. So we've got 5 atomic sentences. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16, times 2 is 32. So we've got 32 rows. Holy moly. Okay, for the sake of time, I've just gone ahead and auto-filled the rows, but let's walk through these together. If we have 32 rows of the truth table, that means that we have 16 T's, 16 F's for our leftmost atomic sentence. Why is that? Well, this is the standard, but also we start with A because A is the first atomic sentence in the argument that we're given in exercise 4.24. Then remember for B, we take half of 16, right? And that means that we've got 8 true, 8 false. So half of 16 becomes 8 true, 8 false. Then half of 8 becomes 4 true, 4 false, and so forth. Then half of 4 becomes pairs of T's and F's. And then lastly, we alternate true, false, true, false, true, false, all the way down. Okay, now don't forget how we add columns after a sentence, whether it's atomic or in the argument that we're constructing. We either work from our drop-down menu or depending on what type of machine we're using, we use Command A or Control A. So our first premise, sentence 1, reads as follows. It's not the case that A or B or C. Then we have, it's not the case that C or, oops, D. Then we have, it's not the case, parentheses, B, and it's not the case that E. And then remember, Boole does not specify the conclusion, right? We know that the fourth sentence, so number 4 is the conclusion. So it doesn't specify the conclusion as such. D, or it's not the case that A, or it's E. So remember when we're working through our determination of the main connective for a sentence that has more than one connective, rather, we look at the scope, right? So sentence 1's negation covers only A, and then we know that when we have repeated disjunctions or repeated conjunctions, the default is that the second disjunction is the main connective, and Boole also reminds us that this is the case. Sentence 2, the negation covers just C, so the main connective is the disjunction. 3, the main connective is the negation. Remember, what's inside the parenthetical is never the main connective, but within the parenthetical, the conjunction drives the sentence. That's because the negation covers only E. And then lastly, similarly to sentence number 1, we've got a repeated disjunction. The negation covers, in this case, only A. And so the second disjunction is our main connective. Let's go ahead and work these in order. And because we have so many T's and F's, before we determine whether or not 4 is in fact a tautological consequence of the first 3 sentences, I'm going to verify that we've correctly, completely and correctly constructed the truth table. So let's start churning out values. We've got negation A for 16 rows. And then we're going to compare negation with B by way of the disjunction. And then lastly, the disjunction, which is the main connective. Now we'll move on to not C. Again, Boole is very helpful. Boole tells us what we're supposed to be looking at by highlighting the referent column or columns, depending on the type of sentence you have. And then the disjunction. And now we move over to negation E. And because I'm moving through this quickly and I'm speaking, it's possible I can make a mistake. So again, it's a very good reason to take advantage of Boole's help in determining whether or not we've completely and correctly constructed the table. And then lastly, the negation in sentence 3. Oops, I made a mistake, didn't I? Okay, so true, false, true, false, true, false, true, false, true, 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 true. I think what I might do is make an error on purpose. So that we can see what happens when we've made an error and Boole tells us. So I'm going to make the last evaluation or determination rather of the truth value in sentence 3 erroneous, so that when I verify the table, we can look at what happens, what Boole tells us. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is determine the value of the negation of A. So we've got, what is it, 16 falses and then 16 trues. Then we'll move to the disjunction. And then the main disjunction. Okay, so let's verify the table and notice what Boole does for us. The row where the error that we committed occurs is highlighted. So we'll go back in here and we will fix this bad boy up. So the value should be true. And we'll verify the table, and now we're given the thumbs up, if you will, that we've correctly completed our table. Okay, so let's not forget what we're after here. We're looking to see if there is a row on which the conclusion, sentence 4, is false, while the premises, sentences 1, 2, and 3, are all true. So there's a fair amount of T and F work to get to in some sense, but in another sense not. Look at the fact that we only have 1, 2, 3, 4 instances where the conclusion is false. So let's look across at the values under the main connective for each of sentences 1, 2, and 3 to see if in those instances where the conclusion is false, all the premises are true. And we see that in sentence 3, the row where sentence 4 is false, sentence 3 is also false. So we don't have to worry about that. What about the next row where sentence 4 is false? Where sentence 4 is false, we look across and we see, in fact, sentence 2 is also false, so we're good to go. When we look at the next iteration of the conclusion being false, and we look across, we see that, okay, sentence 3 is true, but sentence 2 is false, so we're good to go there. And then lastly, where where sentence 4 is false, sentence 3 is true, sentence 2 is true, but sentence 1 is false. So there is no row on which the conclusion is false while the premises are true. So we say that sentence 4 is a tautological consequence of the others. Let's verify, and we're correct. So there's a whole lot of work to do here, right? I hope that that's clear to you. Now, I know we're working exercise 4.24, but I do want to take advantage of the exercise to work with Fitch for a moment to show in exercise 4.20 and 4.24 the distinction between an anacon and a tautcon. So we know that if a sentence is a tautcon of the other sentences, in other words, if the conclusion is a tautological consequence of the premises, then that means that it's a valid argument, which means that it's also the case that the conclusion is an analytical consequence of the premises or premise. But the converse doesn't always hold true. So I want to bring Fitch up and enter these two arguments into Fitch so that you can see, for example, with the huge number of T's and F's flying around here, you can see that, in fact, Fitch uses the Boole algorithm to show us whether or not the sentence is a tautological consequence. We just don't see that algorithm running in the background. But then also, as I mentioned, I want us to see the difference between tautcon and anacon. So hold on just one second. Okay, so I've opened up Fitch, and I have manually inputted the premises and the conclusion. So 1, 2, 3 premises, and then beneath the little Fitch bar is the conclusion. Now, I mentioned to you that what we've done in Boole is what happens in the background when we have our cursor at a sentence that we say follows from other sentences that are highlighted. So we've selected sentences 1, 2, and 3, and you can see that they show up as the citations. And then what I'm doing now under the rule menu is going to con, and I pick tautcon, and what I'm saying is that these sentences 1, 2, and 3 guarantee sentence 4 by way of the truth definitions and the truth table built out of those definitions and the connectives that govern the elements. So if I click check step, I get a check mark, and it happens very quickly. But what Fitch is doing is running effectively Boole in the background. So you're getting a truth table churned out very quickly that shows you that, in fact, this sentence is a tautological consequence of the others. Now, we mentioned earlier that any sentence that's a tautcon of another or other sentences is also an anacon. In other words, tautological consequence is the concept of validity as it plays out in a truth table. Anacon, or analytical consequence, is the broader concept. It just says that the argument is valid. But it's not necessarily the case that an argument that we would call an analytical consequence, or let me rephrase that for clarity. It's not the case that a sentence that is an analytical consequence of another sentence or sentences is going to be a tautological consequence, right? It's not necessarily the case. So consider the following. So suppose that I say A is larger than B, B is larger than C, or sorry, C, and then my, oh, hold on, I messed up. I need a new premise. So A is larger than B, B is larger than C, and then my inference, A is larger than C, right? You and I say, oh, number 3 is an analytical consequence of 1 and 2, right? Just by the meanings of, the meaning of the predicate larger, and in connection with the atomic sentences A, B, C, the way they're laid out, I get the inference, right? Namely that A is larger than C. I extract number 3 from understanding the relational predicate larger in connection with the atomic sentence, individual constant, rather, A, individual constant, B, individual constant, C. But we don't get an anacon, right? Or sorry, we don't get a tautcon, I should say. Why? Well, we've seen this already when we were looking at truth table equivalence, right? There's no connective here. The truth table has nothing to operate on by way of connectives. And so we can't say that just because this is a valid argument, that the argument is also evaluatable or accessible as a tautcon. Okay. Now, let's go back to the first exercise in this video. That was exercise 4.20. So now I've just brought back the exercise. So we have our reference, and we saw when we constructed the truth table that the second sentence is a tautological consequence of the first. So when I highlight number one as the support step and I choose tautcon as the justification, I get a check mark. And because the inference is a tautcon, it's also, it's also an anacon. Remember, however, that just because an inference is an analytical consequence of a premise or premises, that does not guarantee that the inference is also a tautological consequence. Take the following example. Suppose we have the sentence A is small, and we're told that A is identical to B, and the inference that we draw is that B is small. Now, if I click on 1 and 2 as my sources, and I click on Anacon, as you can imagine, right, we get a check mark. Now, if I click on TautCon, I get an X, right? So even though sentence 3 is not a tautological consequence, that doesn't mean the argument is bad. It just means that the truth table can't work on this argument, right? There are no connectives. We do have the first order notation of the identity symbol, so we can say that this inference is an FOCon. So it's an analytical consequence, it's a first order consequence. We'll talk more about first order consequence later, but since it's there now, let's just acknowledge it. But it is not a tautological consequence. So it doesn't rise to the level, if you will, of what the truth table demands, but that, for all of that, does not make the argument a bad argument. Okay, I hope that working through tautological consequence in exercises 4.20 and 4.24 has been helpful, as well as taking a little bit of a detour to talk about the distinction between tautcon and anacon in Fitch.